Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 30th of April and today we have numerous updates. We're going to begin with the southern Donetsk front, looking at battles near Bakhatir. We'll then move northwards to the Dnipro direction, looking at clashes in Nadivka and Uspenivka. A lot of the video will be devoted to the Toritsk region, and then a bit to the west, Russian advances near Sukhabalka. We'll look at the Russians advancing just to the northeast of Severis and entering into Hryhorivka, along with advances deeper into the village of Nove. We'll then spend, I would say, the bulk of the video on the border between Russia and Ukraine, specifically around Belgorod. We'll look at the developments from the Ukrainian incursion over there and how it's being scaled back. We're also going to look at the order of battle from that region and a new Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region, along with really numerous sizable Russian advances deeper into Sumy oblast, including an entrance into a new village. And if you guys are interested, I have also created a map to track the border clashes and ceasefire violations in Jammu and Kashmir, specifically regarding the conflict that is currently brewing between India and Pakistan. So I'll leave a link to that map in the description. And if there's enough popular support, then I might actually upload a video on it. But that really depends on how the situation there unfolds. Now let's get into the video itself. So you can see over here that we have numerous geolocations indicating that the Russian forces have intensified offensive activity both the southeast and directly south of Bakhatir. This is instead of attacking directly head on towards the eastern entrance to Oleksivka and of course Bakhatir along either a highway or adjacent to the Vovcha River. And this is something that we discussed for numerous weeks now. We've discussed the fact that the Russian forces would prefer not to launch such a frontal assault. They did actually do it at the beginning of the month, and they were able to sort of cut down the amount of distance needed to arrive from Andrivka to the next village by about 45%, but the next 55% would, of course, be even more difficult due to the Ukrainian garrison, being able to solidify, sending in reinforcements, and generally creating a solid defense line, meaning that any deeper penetrations could theoretically be possible, but would have rather high losses yielded as a result. So the Russians have recently opted to begin attacking southwards, trying to take advantage of the fact that the Ukrainians don't have a solid line of defense over here, including trenches or density in houses, basements, and such. These areas that the Russians are seizing right now are largely open fields and some tree lines, and those are the areas that troops can actually advance through with some semblance of concealment. And the Ukrainians simply lack the manpower. And even if they did have the manpower in these regions, because it's not that the Ukrainians suffer from a shortage when it comes to the brigades on paper operating around here, although most of them are sort of situated around the eastern approaches and not necessarily a bit to the south. Nonetheless, there are forces over here, like the 23rd Mechanized Brigade, like the 37th Marine Brigade, that are both involved in the recent clashes, but they don't have an area near the front line within, I don't know, 3 kilometers of where the Russians are advancing through. They can situate themselves in on a permanent basis in order to then be sent out for frontline missions whenever the task is required of them. And so then it becomes much more difficult for them to resist in exposed locations like fields and tree lines, and then some sort of isolated house in the middle of a highway. So that's why the Russians are taking advantage of these routes, and they're using, in some cases, armored columns. And whenever that happens, there is a tank leading the column or two, and then there are MTLBs accompanying it. But for the most part, the assaults over here are being conducted on quad bikes, on motorcycles, on ATVs, and other lighter vehicles, sometimes private civilian vehicles as well. And as a result, a lot of these fields have been seized by the Russians. You can see over here 4.7 square kilometers of territory captured. The extent of the advance is around 4 kilometers northwards, and you could see that there is a paved route that the Russians are generally pushing through, which will give them access to the junction over here. And from there, they can overrun the only trenches located along the southern outskirts of the town. Likewise, the Russians also advanced 4.5 kilometers slightly to the east and were still able to advance along this southern highway, taking over some of the outskirts of Rozliv, and thereby also took over a nearby gas station. As a result, the Russians are only about 2 kilometers away from Bakhatir from the east, and from the south, they're about 2.1 kilometers away. You can see there are some geolocations to back up these claims. So on April 28th, at 37th Marine Brigade, they conducted FPV strikes hitting the gas station, giving us an indication of the forward line of contact. On that same day, they also dropped grenades onto individual Russian soldiers as they were advancing out of Roslev and trying to conceal themselves in those forested areas. So that gives us a good gauge, good metric of where the Russians are currently situated and how the Russians are trying to use and take advantage of this weak point to undermine Ukraine's forward line of defense over here, and more generally, the chain of villages that are running along the Vavta River all the way to the border between Donetsk and Dnipro, as we've consistently reiterated. Now, to zoom in on the Dnipro region, we do have some Russian advances of notes. So you can see just to the east of Kotlyarivka, the Russians have been able to achieve a sizable gain amounting to nearly 3 square kilometers. You can see this includes the full capture of Nadivka's outskirts. That includes some of these trenches that you see marked in yellow. And these are areas where the Ukrainians were able to hold out for an extremely long time, largely from the 59th Assault Brigade, and that's also one of the units involved in the Usmanivka defense. So they've been involved in high intensity fighting and have succeeded in dragging out such fighting for an extended period of time. Now, with that being said, the Russians have finally been able to push them out of some of the nearby warehouses and dugouts. And as a result, we have this yellow polygon. Then to the west, this is an area that's more exposed. It's an area that's lacking in stable, solid defenses. So the Russians took advantage of that naturally and were able to push, let's see how much farther north, about 1.4 kilometers northwards. As a result, Kotlyarivka, this hamlet over here, is flanked from the east, and there's already pressure building on it from the south, meaning it's going to be difficult for the Ukrainians to drag out fighting over here, given how small it is, how isolated it is from other Ukrainian nodes of defense like Horikove and Troitsk to the south that actually are close by and are also pretty close to these Dragon's Teeth and trenches to the west. So there is a bit of continuity with the Ukrainian defense line over here. But then Kotlyarivka is a bit disconnected, you could say, meaning that they will be in an exposed position and the Russians could actually go in and try to take it over in the near future. At the same time, the Russians are working on building up a base of operations and garnering more positions in order to launch an assault northwards. They want to take over an area spanning from the current Ukrainian line of contact to the Solona River. It's an area that spans a bit more than 5 kilometers. And those open fields, once you overrun several just local fortresses, because they are important and they are difficult to overrun, but they're not necessarily connected together, all of these fortresses. So they could be passed in between. If you're imagining a Russian armored assault or just troops advancing on foot, they could be isolated and then just targeted in a fire bag in order to force Ukrainian squads to withdraw from these areas. So there are ways to avoid the full extent of the Ukrainian defensive wrath with some of these defensive positions, especially given how disconnected they are from the main Ukrainian garrisons that are located in some populated areas a bit to the north. So, with all that being said, the Russians are planning to advance northwards and create a strong southern flank to apply pressure to Novo-Oleksandrivka, Novoserhivka, and Novomikhailovka. More generally, any village that is running along the Solona River that is on the Donetsk side of the border is currently a target for the Russian side. And now they're going to be much more galvanized because, for the most part, Uspanivka has been cleared. There has been a consistent back and forth between Russian and Ukrainian soldiers over here, especially from the 9th Infantry Battalion of the 59th Brigade, but it has not been enough to fully, I suppose, stop Russia's offensive capacity in this region. So they were able to absorb losses, absorb territorial losses as well. And now they've been able to fully reconquer the village. I suppose not fully, because there is this northwestern chunk, this corner that still remains under Ukrainian control. But that is just sort of the outskirts. The Russians are now planning on solidifying this line and then moving on to apply pressure to Novo-Oleksandrivka. Easier said than done, but the Russians are hoping it will be easier to do so once they have an accompanying southern flank to push in sync. You can see how it would sort of unfold using these arrows over here. And the units involved in defense would be 59th Brigade and 11th National Guard Brigade. So keep an eye out for their actions and how the Russians go about pushing through those open fields. In Udachne, an area where there's also been an extended Ukrainian defensive period recently, they were able to repel some Russian assaults and actually conduct their own localized counterattacks to push the Russians out of positions to the northeast of the town. But recently, the Russians have been able to regain some of the initiative and take back zero point 0.5 square kilometers of territory. I want to see if there's a geolocation. So the Black Sky FPV group, they conducted strikes on eastern Udachne, targeting individual Russian soldiers as they were passing through residential areas. So you can see the Russians have been able to reaffirm their positions over here, giving them a base through which in the future to advance into the center of the village. And as I've mentioned so many times by now, Udachny is so important because it would give the Russians both the northern flank to the Solona River villages, which is an entirely different discussion in its own right that we talked about before. But it could also give them direct access to the highway, to the T0406 highway, to advance towards the border and then reach an area like Novopirhorodne and then overrun the anti-tank ditches and trenches that were built to separate the Donetsk and Dnipro oblast boundary. Besides that, there's also the concern of then the Russians expanding northwards through open fields in areas that are generally unprotected and getting very close to the E50 highway that acts as a supply route into Pokrovsk from the northwest. Currently, one of the most stable lines of logistics for the city runs through this highway, just due to how established it is, how important it is in terms of its durability, and so putting it within the range of fire, even closer to actual physical contact, would be really bad for the defensive structure of Pokrovsk. And that's why the Ukrainians are currently investing so many resources into preventing a blossoming of the front line basically along all three directions that would come with the fall of Vodachina. So that's why you have the deployment of 32nd Brigade, 42nd Brigade, Umbrella Drone Unit, 3rd National Guard Brigade. There's so many units involved with this defensive measure. But nonetheless, the Russians have been able to just steadily advance. Over here around Pischane, there was a plan by the 425th Skala Regiment to conduct a counterattack to reach the villages of Vovkove Solone in order to fully cut off the Russian salient, as you can refer to it, that is currently involved in fighting Iludachin and Kotline. The assault itself failed. It only involved a couple of armored vehicles and 30 soldiers. And so, with that size, it was doomed to fail from the start. But this was like 2 or 3 days ago. And since then, the Russians have actually been able to conduct a counterattack of their own and take back a notable piece of territory. It amounts to 1.2 square kilometers, but it is important because they took back a Ukrainian salient that acted as a forward sort of bulge to apply a lot of pressure onto the outskirts and the perimeter of Russian villages that were taken over along this sort of outer perimeter ring of Pokrovsk. And so this salient, as I refer to it, that you see marked in red, it applied pressure to Shevchenko, Vidorozhenia, and Zelene. But now you have the Russian forces taking it back and approaching the rail line itself, approaching a lot of trenches, trying to overrun them, trying to undermine the Ukrainian defensive effort over here. So you can see the geolocation that I'm clicking on is from April 29th. It's from the Skala Regiment. They killed 3 Russian soldiers as they were entering into a trench located to the northeast of Shevchenko and pretty close to the Solanki River. Also, it was essentially right on the line, the outer perimeter defense line of the city. So you can see that marked in yellow as the Russian troops were trying to enter into those fortifications. It's not the final line of defenses because there's also one immediately outside of the city, but it's the second to last one. And for that reason, the Ukrainians would like to drag out the fighting over there for as long as possible. It's also why they try to counterattack whenever there is a sort of inkling that the Russians will be able to fully take control of the second perimeter. And that's why they try to just drag out fighting by sending in small squads into certain regions. It's not necessarily with the goal of permanently holding on to a certain region, but just about creating enough of a nuisance in order to distract Russian forces from advancing deeper elsewhere. When it comes to the I don't even know what I would refer to this. The T0504 highway front, I guess you could say that. The Russians have been able to take over what amounts to 3 square kilometers of territory. So they captured Vodiane Drucha in its entirety along with Berezhivka. Here's the geolocation from April 25th. The 117th Sumy Territorial Defense Brigade, they conducted grenade drops on houses and tree lines around this village of Berezhivka. This means that right now you have a really sizable stretch of land. Let's measure it. That is extremely close to the highway, meaning that, yeah, perhaps on a daily basis you do see some movement along this highway, but it is extremely difficult because you do have physical control. Not yet, but there is that possibility in the near future. And you also have Russian soldiers situated on hills overlooking the highway in certain locations, not in Berezhivka, but perhaps to the south of it. And they have just a clear line of sight onto whatever's moving past it, meaning that the logistics situation between Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk is a bit more complicated. Obviously, there are still shipments going on, but it's not as direct as before because, for the most part, you have the large convoys sort of taking this route from Shahove, and then from there, maybe taking it and sort of inroad eastwards and then entering into Konstantinivka from there, or completing the full circle like this and entering in through the northwestern approaches of the city. So, all in all, it is a bit of a disruption for the Ukrainian garrison and its connectivity in Donetsk. But when we look at the minutia, it also means that the Russians are taking over additional territory that can be used to flank the Ukrainian salient that is getting larger by the day, that is sort of sandwiched in between the Pokrovsk and Toritsk fronts. This area is becoming, I suppose, larger vertically, and then horizontally it's beginning to shrink because you have these sort of encroaching axes and vectors of attack from the west and from the east. But at the same time, you're not seeing a lot of the assailants over here decrease when it comes to their depth, meaning that a withdrawal is going to become more difficult when the day comes and the Ukrainians are forced out. And then obviously there's going to be higher casualties yielded in that process. So over here we see that the 91st Anti-Tank Battalion was moved away from Dnipro, an area where it defended for a very long time, and is currently deployed as a reinforcement mechanism to hold on and just drag out fighting within this part of the front line near Zelenopola and Alexandropol. So that's the only reinforcement I've seen deployed to this region, and it's actually just a battalion and not even a full brigade-sized unit. So definitely the Ukrainians will need to invest in more resources, more manpower for this region if they would hope to, at the very least, drag out fighting for a long time, or perhaps even create a new solid defense line that doesn't fully cede control of this salient to Russian hands. Over here in Sukhabalka, you can see the Russians advanced 50 hectares north of the village, but nothing more than that. Over here, south of Shchuchybinivka, the Russians have lost zero point 0.6 square kilometers of territory. You have captures by the Ukrainian side. There's a geolocation here from April 29th of the Rubicon FPV group. I believe it's a training center, but they had a lot of their operators destroying Ukrainian vehicles on the roads in Sumy, entering into Kursk a couple of months ago. But now their instructors and operators are deployed all across the front line. So over here, their FPV strikes hit just many houses, a whole host of them in Lenidivka, or not that Lenidivka, but in Novospassky and Trubinivka. And one of the geolocations proved to us that the Ukrainians do have slightly more control in this region than we previously imagined, which could explain why they've been able to maintain connectivity and connection with the positions that are a bit to the east or in the Zabalka region, where we haven't gotten much of an update from. But I would say that it's likely that there are still Ukrainian squads operating over here, roaming around. The situation likely is fluid, but they have not been fully pushed out because they have this outlet running through the Kryvyi Terets River and the populated areas in Trubinivka. Then to the north over here, we have this geolocation, and it indicates an advance of zero point 0.9 square kilometers of territory. So this is something that was released, or geolocated rather, on April 26th, but it could be from earlier. Some sources are claiming that this video and its compilation is from the earlier periods of April, which is certainly possible, but I can't say for sure either way. What we do know is that the 120th Reconnaissance Regiment, they released this video, I believe it was on Instagram, and they highlighted how they dropped grenades onto individual Russian soldiers as they crossed through the open fields that are northwest of Toretsk, and we could see the extent of it about 2 kilometers, and then made it to the rail line, made it near some of the houses over here that connect between, I don't even know which neighborhood this is. It's probably an extension of Novospassky, and then from there connects to Kateranivka and Klebanbik. So as a result, you could see how there's been a physical separation between the rear areas like Ivanopilia, Plachishivka, and then by extension Konstantinivka. And to the south, the actual frontline garrison that has been able to dig in for such a long time around Novospassky. So it's not a complete physical dismemberment, but it is just something that makes movement back and forth that much more difficult. And if they're able to retain control over it, it will give the Russian side a stronger base to continue infiltrating into this rail line. And then by extension, getting control over its entirety to then focus on approaching the suburbs of Konstantinivka in the near future. But none of that can really be done in earnest until the Ukrainian threats in these two towns are fully cleared out, because they do present a significant threat to the Russian garrison. They also give a base, a linchpin for small squads to infiltrate into various parts of the Toritsk perimeter, which then creates a headache for the Russians, and they have to focus on that rather than their own offensive activities. Even if they eventually succeed in repelling them, it is a way to really drag out time in a significant manner. You can see over here 11 hectares of territory captured just in northern parts of Delivka. You can see the Predator Police Brigade, their FPVs, conducted strikes on dugouts in houses over here, April 27th, that was. So Russian soldiers seen entering into basements or into dugouts near the summer camps and the ponds. They were struck there individually. And the fighting over there is largely done from afar. You don't really see close quarters engagements anymore in these regions. It's just Russian soldiers trying to evade drones as they advance deeper and take over local targets. And at the same time, you can see how there's so many salients forming that will be closed in the future if this sort of pressure continues. So keep an eye out for that. Looking at the Severis front, this is interesting. The Russians have been able to capture what amounts to nearly 3 square kilometers of territory. You can see over here that April 28th, that Apache drone unit, which is a part of the 81st Air Mobile Brigade, the FPVs hit dugouts and houses in Rihorivka, which gave us a good indication that Russian ground soldiers were able to finally enter into the village. We've been talking about this region for, nearly 3 years now, the Rihorivka region, because after the fall of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, the Russians pushed into Belohorivka and then made their initial incursions into Rihorivka and Serebryanka. That was when the Ukrainians were able to take advantage of different topographies and that sort of local advantage when it came to the Ukrainians' positions on ridges to push back the Russians to areas near Bilohorivka that are sort of split between hills and really low-lying valleys, and that's where the sort of front line laid for a very long time without much movement. But recently, Bilohorivka was captured along with some of its northern outskirts that are on high elevation that actually are directly adjacent to the Donetsk River. And it gave a perfect avenue for Russian soldiers on foot to push westwards. And now they've been able to infiltrate into Rihorivka, all with the objective of squeezing out this Ukrainian pocket, this sort of salient of resistance that doesn't really have any basis in any one trench or town. It's just a piece of land that includes forested patches and open fields that the Ukrainians have seemingly been refusing to withdraw from, and as a result, have been able to drag out the fighting and prevent any sort of buffer from approaching and getting closer to Seversk. But now you can see this northern route is trying to change that reality, both by directly pushing along the river and then also by moving south westwards to seize this entire salient that we've circled over here. So keep an eye out for that, as the fighting over there really does change in terms of its scale depending on whatever opportunities the Russians sense. It's not a critical part of the front line for now. Around Nova, the Russians have captured the entirety of the town, and it is a pretty large one. You could see over here, April 30th, the Russian forces pushed out Ukrainian squads. The Ukrainians were filmed by Russian drones as they were getting pushed out and as they were getting picked off by grenade drops. And as Russian soldiers themselves were mining the houses and basements wherein the Ukrainians were hidden. And then you could see how in the aftermath footage, the position that the Ukrainians were in just gets completely destroyed by these either tank mines or some other indeed personnel mine, for instance, that gets thrown in to house and then just generates this massive explosive yield and could lead to serious injuries for whatever forces are inside those houses. And then we could see by the end of the drone video how the Russians raised their flag in Nova and how the Ukrainian squads that survived were able to make it out and ran to nearby villages. This also gives the Russians access to this highway that advances southwards all the way to the outskirts of Liman, as we've mentioned so many times by now, and then also to the north pushes along this chain of villages that acts as a solid Ukrainian defense line. Over here, you can see that the Russian forces captured what amounts to, what is it, like 2 kilometers, 2.16 kilometers. And you can see over here that the 4th Mechanized Battalion's FPV crews, they hit 5 Russian soldiers as they were approaching the local battalion positions. I would say those battalion positions are situated in these forested slivers that you see over here. And as they were getting too close for comfort, that's when the drone crews were activated and struck those individual soldiers. But nonetheless, based on the footage itself, it indicates to us that you do have over here, uh, on the border, an advance by the Russian side, taking over the Luhansk border region. At the same time, I want to look at the Oskil River fronts. You could see just a minor advance in Kamyanka. You could see that it amounts to 0.6 square kilometers, but it could be the full capture of the town, actually. We just have to wait for additional corroboration. On April 28th, the Russians took 3 POWs in Kamyanka and they raised their flags. Then on April 28th as well, the 344th Motoref Regiment, they raised their flag in the northern part of the village and released footage of how their soldiers were undermining houses and destroying them if there was a suspicion of Ukrainian soldiers being present over there. So now you can see how the goal is shifting towards just a sort of clearing up operation of the nearby outskirts, trying to also fully seize control of nearby salients that could be forming, where the Ukrainians could try to just form these small pockets of resistance. You can see it over here, and that will give the Russians a solid base in Kamyanka, that being a rather large and populated area, a base to then advance deeper through open areas and flank villages like Bolohivka or what is that? Stroyovka. Now, moving on to the Kursk region and Belgorod, you can see how Ukrainian sources have actually admitted that they've been pushed out of an area west of Demidovka. So in this lever of territory south of the Midovka, you can see it over here. The Russians were able to advance around 700 meters westwards, and this is an area that's largely open fields, which made it easier for the Russians to push the Ukrainians out without much resistance. The Ukrainians, though, have shifted towards a defensive-minded operation, trying to take advantage of the dense shrubbery and the anti-tank ditches built by the Russians during the 2023 Surovikin era, in order to prevent the Russians from fully restoring the border over here. So that's why you see continued clashes over the final 7.7 square kilometers of the Belgorod region that remain under Ukrainian control. But now you actually do have Russian forces that are pretty solidly situated within Demidovka and Popovka, and their objective will be to restore the border. But the fear from the Ukrainian side is that then once that border is restored, and a lot of the obstacles, natural obstacles that the Russians have along this border region would be under their control once again, they would have a large garrison of forces deployed to this region that could actually cross over the border into Sumy from another direction and take over areas that are not well defended, that are pretty exposed, and actually are connected by local routes. And so there could be a lot of villages that end up being caught in the crossfire and could potentially be occupied as a result. And so now it's shifted towards a defensive minded operation, not necessarily a sort of attack, counterattack sort of mindset for the Ukrainian forces, either from the 33rd Assault Regiment, 225th Assault Regiment, 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, 47th Mechanized Brigade. There are a couple of other units like elements of the 414th UAV Regiment, which is obviously the members of Magyar units, which is deployed partially to the Donetsk region as well, but they're also operating around here. You also have the Consolidated Rifle Battalion of the Air Force, which is partially deployed to the Dnipro direction, but also apparently has some of its forces attached to the assault battalions that are fighting over here. And as I said before, they're trying to hold the line where it currently is located and try to distract the Russians by opening up another front, albeit not anything too significant, just a minor advance into the Kursk region. So you can see it amounts to about 1.1 kilometers of an advance by the Ukrainians south of their border region, and it's actually pretty close to the border between Kursk and Belgorod. So I wouldn't even associate it with what's going on right now in Gornal in Oleshnia on a tactical level, but it is still important because it acts as a diversion. It acts as a diversion as the Russians are in the final phase of clearing out the border regions, the border forests, the houses on the border, in areas that are just outside of Gornal and Oleshnia. So it acts as a distraction mechanism for the developments over there and the further delving into Sumy, along with the current Russian counterattacks that are reclaiming large chunks of Belgorod. And at the same time, the Russian forces deployed over here on April 30th, they detected the Ukrainian advance and shelled it accordingly. So the Ukrainians did not reach any populated areas like Kucherov, Malaivka, or Goptarovka. They were just shelled as they entered into forested areas on April 30th. And that comes from the Akhmat 204th Special Purpose Regiment. The full list of deployments for units over here on the Russian side. It reads as follows. So you have the 34th Independent Motor Rifle Mountain Brigade, their one unit. You have the 128th Motorized Rifle Brigade, 83rd Motorized Rifle Brigade, or regiment rather, and they are one of these newer units, 2024, late 2023 era units. And there were a lot of them that are a part of the northern group of forces that were either operating around Kursk up until recently or in the Vovchansk region, and now they've been deployed to Belgorod. You also have one of the Akhmat regiments, probably the 204th. You have a battalion from the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade and a battalion from the 88th Recon and Sabotage Brigade Española. They are pretty well known. There are also some PMCs within that unit, and you also have elements of the FSB fighting within the Belgorod region. At the same time, though, we have a really deep advance by the Russian side near villages such as Luknaya and Bilovodi. So first with Luknaya, you can see over here in advance amounting to 10 square kilometers. That is substantial. It is through an area that is almost completely open. There are not many Ukrainian physical boundaries that could be utilized to apply defense against the Russian attacks over here. That means naturally the Russians will send in troops on foot if it's a tree line or through motorcycles if there's an open area and a local route. And that's what we see over here. So two Russian quad bikers, they were killed by mines. This was April 27th, and this was just west of Luknaya. This gives us an indication that the Ukrainians are no longer present over here and the Russians were able to advance 4 kilometers southwards. It is a notable advance, of course. But the question is whether the Russians will be able to turn a transient state of advances through these regions that then eventually lead to casualties into a permanent settlement. And the only way that would be possible is by capturing adjacent houses, such as the houses in Loknaya. So now the question is, will the Russians be able to continue advancing southwards along this riverbed over here and take over the entirety of Luknaya, because that will give the Russians a solid base to then project control over the fields either to the east or to the west, giving the Russians, by extension, a solid perimeter to launch their attacks north of Yunakivka and from the east towards Yublanivka. And at the same time, while all of this is unfolding, you do have two salients that have formed where Ukrainian squads are still situated trying to drag out fighting. One of them is in between Veselivka and Zhuravka, a really exposed position, and same thing in between Bilovodi and Loknaya. And the question is, how long will they be able to maintain control in these regions? But they are trying not to withdraw, because then it will give the Russians a much more unified position that is much more seeped into Sumy. So the hope from the Ukrainians would be to just hold out and drag the fighting over here for as long as possible, and then to have their garrisons either stabilize the front line or conduct some sort of localized counterattack like they did in Loknaya a couple of weeks ago to reestablish some semblance of normalcy along the front line. So the Ukrainian units that are involved in that, as we've said numerous times, include the 67th Mechanized Brigade. That's one of the main units fighting over here. And you also have over here with this video in Bilovodi mention of the unit because they conducted grenade drop operations targeting 7 Russian soldiers as they were entering into the village from Zhuravka that was previously captured. So you can see the advance over here accounts for 4.56 square kilometers of territory. And then over here, you can see that it is a 4.2 kilometer advance southwards. And a lot of these residential areas have already fallen into Russian control, but the core of the town still remains to be conquered. But it would certainly serve as a connection between the current theater going on to the west around Zhuravka, Veselivka, and then the eastern theater that is much more well positioned, which is an area where Basivka is located. And Bilovodi would sort of just be a way to connect and have a conduit between those two vectors in order to unify and eventually reach the highway over here. What is it called? I don't even know what it's called, but it's a highway that leads into Sumy. So that is a really important target for the Russians if they're looking to expand control, create a security zone, create a 10-kilometer buffer, and be able to situate artillery within the Ukrainian part of Sumy in order to fire into the city itself. So that's all that for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.